Welcome to Africa Aspirations. This is your go-to podcast for in-depth conversations about the socioeconomic and the political issues affecting Africa and, of course, shaping our continent. My name is Fola Folayan, and I'm your weekly host on this podcast. And, of course, I'm joined with Africa's sharpest minds, these three gentlemen. Right beside me, I have Lonzen Rugira. How are you, Lonzen?
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you here.
Yeah,
I'm good.
Thank you.
And of course, joining us virtually on this podcast is investigative journalist and author David Hundeyin. Hello, David.
Hi, Fola. Hi, Lonzen.
Hi, David.
Welcome. And of course, Levi Kabwato is also joining us. He's an investigative, maybe not investigative. He's a journalist and, of course, a political scientist. He likes to be addressed as a political commentator. Hello, Levi.
Hi, Fola. How you doing?
Very well,
Do not dress me in borrowed robes.
I should not dress in borrowed robes. Okay, fine. Okay, let's get in. So grab your coffee, sit back, relax, and get ready to join this conversation. We are starting this podcast discussing the Africa-China relationship. It's a topmost issue on our table today because just recently the Africa-China summit happened and African leaders were in China to discuss economics, to discuss trade, to discuss finance, to discuss, infrastructure development and all sorts of issues. But this is not the first time that the continent, Africa, has been having relationships with, other external bodies. So what is different about this particular relationship with China? What should we expect? What should we be asking about right now?
Like we were saying before about Africa's aspirations, we need to first identify what is it that we want, what is in the strategic interest of Africa as an entity. So if you follow what Xi Jinping was saying, Xi Jinping was outlining a vision for Africa. He should not be outlining a vision for Africa.
Right.
Yes. If you follow his speech, he was speaking as someone who understands very well Africa's challenges, but at the same time, his understanding of Africa's challenges should not put him in the driving seat of articulating those challenges. So if you've read his speech clearly. So Africans first must assert themselves around certain interests, shared interests, and they should articulate these interests and they should meet in these forums in a way that they are engaging to assert their interest vis-a-vis the interest of whoever has invited them, including China. So there's nothing wrong with what Xi Jinping said in terms of the substance, but at the same time, we do not agree with anyone drafting a vision for us. And this is why we talk about Africa's aspirations. So others may have aspirations for us, but however well-intentioned those aspirations are, the extent to which we articulate them ourselves, the extent to which we identify these problems and the priority of the problems we face, and how we will pursue their execution is the extent to which we'll have the ownership, even the ability to engage whoever wants to partner with us in a meaningful manner.
David, do you agree?
I completely agree. I agree that right now it seems as though China is pretty much the only game in town. It's the only deal, if there's such a thing, worth discussing. And certainly from Xi Jinping's words, you can clearly see that there is at least some understanding of the actual economic issues that are facing Africa and the solutions that Africa does need. However, I also do agree that in as much as Xi Jinping proposed a raft of solutions and recommendations and plans and whatnot, those are not Africa's plans. Those are China's plans
For Africa, exactly.
So to a large extent, they happen to coincide with what we perceive to be our interests. To a large extent, there is some what's the word I'm looking for? Synergy there. However, it's also the case that in the world of geopolitics, there are no permanent friends and no permanent enemies. National interests can and do change all the time. So if right now China's interests happen to be aligned with those of Africa,
Mm,
uh, once upon a time, China's interests were significantly aligned to maybe those of India, for example.
mm.
Nowadays, there's no direct fight between China and India, and both of them are more or less in a state of de facto war with each other.
I mean,
So
I'm sorry to
that's what I mean when I
interrupt
say
you.
that national interest.
Yes, I want to interrupt you by, pointing out something that you and Lonzen just said. And that is almost, it sounds like everybody seems to know what Africa should be interested in. Almost everybody seems to know what is good for Africa. Everybody wants to say, oh, this is what is good for you. This is what I think is good for you. And I'm throwing this to Levy. At what point will Africa decide to take charge of speaking for itself on global platforms like this and saying, this is what we bring to the table, this is what we're willing to leverage, and this is what you can bring to the table if we're going to talk partnership?
I think for me, to agree with David and Dr. Lonson, this is one of the most painful points every time there's a summit of this nature as an African, because we just go there, invited, we're guests, and almost clueless, right, as a bloc. And that's very unfortunate, right? So we have to ask ourselves, how come Africa does not know what it wants from the rest of the world after all these years, right? So what is the cause of that? So you look at China, say, in 1957, when sub-Saharan Africa is getting its first independence moment with Ghana, where China was and where China is today, where Africa was and where Africa is today, right? Then you say, have we sufficiently captured the common aspirations of people who were fighting against colonialism, for example, so that we could be independent? If we became independent as Africans, what have we done with that independence? So, I mean, this is a long answer to your question, but really, we have to do things differently as Africans, right? I think it goes to what David was alluding to now, to then say, what is the common interest and what is then the national interest as a divided continent, right? So there's all this talk of African unity, we need to do this together. So sure, when FOCAC happens, you might have African leaders in one room together, but they do not share common aspirations as a bloc. And you have to start there. So essentially, you now have Xi Jinping, who knows exactly how to deal with each individual leader, but also is able, for want of a better word, to manipulate the weaknesses that exist when these leaders come back to the continent and now focus on their national interest. So beyond the overall question of unity, we now have to decide for ourselves as to what exactly is the new aspiration for Africa in the 21st century. That's not necessarily different from the African aspiration for independence, and most importantly, for economic independence. Because the political independence, sure, we have it. That's why we have all our leaders in power. But where is the economic independence, and how does that discussion begin to galvanize Africans to reimagine how we relate with countries like China, for example?
I'm glad you mentioned economic independence, and I'm coming to you, London. There's been a lot of talk about Chinese debt trap, and how that African leaders are being led into this trap where we might not recover from economically with China. What do you think is leading all of? Where is this talk coming from? What do you think is driving all of this? And do you believe in it?
Before I talk about that, I want to talk about it is not a coincidence that Xi Jinping understood very well the challenges Africa faces. It's not a coincidence that the priorities Africa faces were aligned in Xi Jinping's speech. It's because he took his time, he did his research, And he wanted to present a picture that's different from his rivals, the Americans, and saying that the Americans, they don't take the time to understand Africa and to do their research and to respond to the aspirations that Africa may be interested in.
What if he's just saying what he thinks we want to hear?
And that's very good. That means he's effective. So it is as opposed to saying that I'm going to partner with you to do these things because I've done my research and I think you need these things, is different than saying I'm going to partner with you about some things that you don't need. That
reminds me of an article that David wrote today.
Yes.
But we'll come back to that some other time.
So we must give the Chinese credit for taking their time to do the research to align their vision for Africa to what Africa actually needs. Now, that does not give them a right to be defining the interest of Africa, but they must be given credit. And their ability to go in depth to try to align their vision to the needs of Africa is not happening in a vacuum. It is happening as a counterpoint to the Americans, and it's trying to show Africans, look, these Americans don't understand you. For us, we understand you. That's why we can work very well with you. These are the real needs you have. We know them. And it will be very difficult for Africans to deny that the vision of G are things that they don't need. It's very difficult.
But does this not bring, gentlemen, I have to throw this out, on the table. Because when you put it that way, so it reminds me of a saying that we have in my village that when two elephants are fighting, the grass underneath, would have to bear the brunt of it. So we have two giants, struggling, and then Africa is in the middle, one pulling the other. And does it not put us in a precarious position where we're like stuck in between two world powers, and each seems to want to know that, or want to say that they know what's best for us? At what point do we say, hey, this is what we choose? We choose what's best for us and not what you think is best for us. How's this going to affect the continent as a whole?
So I think that being in the middle of these two proverbial elephants, three or four actually, if you include the likes of India and to an extent Russia, I think it actually presents a unique opportunity. I think in times past where there was pretty much one global hegemon, maybe between 1989 and maybe the mid noughties, I think those were actually not good times for the so-called African aspiration that we're referring to, because there was only one game in town. So the Americans were the only game in town, and what they said was law. So what's the theory of development according to the Americans was all that you were allowed to do. If you wanted to build a certain type of infrastructure and the Americans said no, then the infrastructure didn't get built. And that was that. Whatever type of economic development model that you wanted for yourself was what the Americans allowed you to have. And that was it. Their world is law. Now, because there is a sort of we're in a multipolar moment in global history, we can actually sort of play both sides off against each other, if that makes sense. So that actually creates, if you recall, the time when Africa had its most spectacular period of growth was maybe from the independence period to maybe sometime in the 70s or maybe mid 80s, which coincided almost exactly with the time at which the Soviet Union was at its most powerful, and Africa was again at that junction, that sweet spot where you could get the best of both worlds. So you could get technical assistance and infrastructure investment and all whatnot from the Soviets. And you get other things. So, like my dad, for example, bringing this home to a localized level. My dad went to university because he got a scholarship that was funded by the US government. And the reason that scholarship existed was because there was a Soviet scholarship, which the US government felt that they had to counteract by putting in their own investment to counterbalance the Soviet influence. So when there are two superpowers competing and using Africa as a sort of narrative battleground, you can see it as a problem, but you can also see it as an opportunity. There's an opportunity in every crisis. I certainly see an opportunity in this moment.
Levi, do you see an opportunity?
But David, yeah, but that's precisely why to take advantage of an opportunity, you have to know that the opportunity exists in the first place. And this is the challenge that we're having with these particular relations, right? Where African leaders are usually just summoned to all these capitals, whether in DC or in Beijing, or even within the European Union as well, right? So we have to know exactly what we want. So the time that David speaks about, for instance, towards the early 90s, late 80s into the early 90s, we actually had something called the Lagos Plan of Action, for example. That was a very visionary document, adopted by most African countries at AU or at that time OAU level, pretty much to just say this is the vision that we have for the continent. Where is the Lagos Plan of Action? I think it's of 1982 today. Nowhere to be seen, but if you were to revisit that document, you would see that all these things that we were speaking about, or what our leaders were speaking about in China recently, in 2024, things like manufacturing, for example, telecommunications, they were thought about as far back as 1982. So you have to ask yourself, why then have these things not been implemented, right? Then you have to look at, is it our form of governance? Is it the types of leaders that we put in power? But also, what are the external that are at play, right? So, Fola, just to one point that you had mentioned around this narrative of, the
Debt
debt
trap.
trap,
Yeah.
China, and so forth, which is, for me, it's a bit fallacious because actually China debt in Africa is still far less, I think still under 5% in total. But you have private lenders, so your IMFs, your World Banks, and other European banks, US banks holding a lot of debt currently, right? Upwards of 5%, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a narrative war that's also coming out, right? So you had the Cold War at some point was in between, but now you have the narrative war that pretty much says, well, China is some kind of scarecrow, or they're going to put you in a debt trap. But in actual fact, China's own aspirations haven't yet even yielded half or close to anything that we currently have from Western countries as well. So the
Talking about
opportunities really
narratives.
depend on. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Levi. Talking about narratives, there's a narrative, or rather, a statement that was made during the summit by the, Chinese leader, and it came from the official state media actually, and they said that China is proposing what they call a 5-no approach to cooperation with African countries. They said no interference in the pursuit of their developmental path that fits their national conditions. They said no interference in their internal affairs, no interference in no imposition of will, and no attachment of political strings. Now, there's been a lot of reactions to this statement, and of course, there are people who say, "Well, this looks good. This is exactly what Africa needs, right? If we're going to have a partnership, we don't need to have an external factor, meddling in Africa's political affairs, meddling within Africa's sovereign states." And there are those who listen with a hint of skepticism, like, maybe you're saying these things because you're courting us right now. Where do you stand, Lonzen?
Yeah, by the way, it was the context of the entire speech, because the context was that every society has a right to pursue modernization. And it must be an autonomous, inward out process. Nobody should try to enlighten others by giving them a blueprint for modernization. And so Xi Jinping was saying, okay, countries can work together, but on condition that they are cooperating to build their autonomous approach to modernization, which every society has. And it was a direct response to the Americans who have actually trying to give the world a blueprint for how modernization should take place.
Or how democracy should be.
Exactly. Basically, westernization. Trying to make an equivalent between westernization and modernization. And this was the counterpoint of Xi Jinping. He said that equating modernization to westernization has been destructive, and that this world is in the mess it is because countries have not had the right, societies have not had the right to pursue modernization that is autonomous and that is grown from homegrown approaches. That there has been an imposition of westernization that has been camouflaged. So basically, Xi Jinping's context for the speech was a counterpoint to the Americans that the destruction of that the world has faced is a direct result of trying to equate modernization with westernization. So he's saying there is another way, and another way China is ready to support this new way, not by equating Chinese modernization to global South modernization. So he's saying that we can, each and every society, each and every country can define its own path to modernization, which it has a right to, but we can work together in cooperation in this. We do not need to impose our own version of modernization to equate it to a universal model. Basically, that's the point.
All right.
But I think another point that I need to point out here is that geopolitics, or the pursuit of geostrategic interests, is a game of leverage. You must leverage. So to leverage, you must have a strong hand. And Africa has the greatest hand when it is working together. Its capacity to leverage the other geostrategic actors to get the most out of the global environment can only be done as a collective. And that the onus is upon the Africans to create that collective to be able to attain the greatest leverage. Now, because you are leveraging against a counterforce, that counterforce has the opposite interest, and that is to break you up. So that engages you as divided as possible. Yeah. So Africans, if they're talking about themselves in a strategic sense, it must be from the point of the greatest leverage and to the awareness that the counterforce to which they wishes to engage them in the most divided form possible.
Exactly. If we have a common goal, if we have a common aspiration,
and the strategy
and a common
for
strategy.
benefiting from that rivalry. Yeah.
All right, that's the same question I'm going to throw to you, Levi, and I'm going to throw to you, David. As tensions are rising now between the US and China, where should Africa place itself? What's the smart way for Africa to handle this and to leverage itself within these two powers?
Well, I mean, if I can go first,
Yes,
David.
please.
Yeah, Africa, Africa has to think about itself primarily, right? So there has been some form of evolution in terms of, through the African Union, for example, as usual, good meetings, good talking points, but hardly any action, right? So China is actually taking advantage of all of these things. So look at the biggest trading partner in Africa, between Africa and, Africa and China. That's South Africa, right? So you have trade valued at about $36 billion annually, if I'm not mistaken. And that's huge. Then you look at South Africa itself as a country, right, with its own sub-imperial aspirations within the region and, of course, within the continent as well, right? So South Africa is also a friend of the US and Europe. You just have to look at what South Africa is thinking around the concept of energy, for example, right? The shift from, the shift onto greener energy, what is usually termed as the just energy transition here. But it essentially involves South Africa shipping a lot of coal to power up European cities, power up European industries, whilst denying South Africans themselves access to electricity. Then you try to reconcile that with, say, manufacturing, the aspirations manufacturing, where China is saying, well, we're going to help you set up, manufacturing in your own country. But with what electricity, for example? or if South Africa says we're going to industrialize, or China is going to help us industrialize, with what energy, provisions, for example. So there are also contradictions that are beginning to emerge. And as a result of these contradictions, African countries would then have to decide and shape a future for themselves that they think is going to lead towards the path of independence and win off the independence. Like Doc has said, China obviously has imperial aspirations, has become an imperial power to a great degree. But how long is it going to take, right? So we are having this conversation in 2024. Perhaps in 2090, that's when China becomes the new United States of America, for example. But is anybody in Africa thinking that far ahead in terms of insulating ourselves, but also thinking that far ahead in terms of how do we then position ourselves? So I think there's still a lot more tension that's going to form within the African bloc itself, within the African Union, and of course within the regional economic communities. So at a SADC level, at an ECOWAS level, um, East African community,
And the
who is
Sahel.
going to have the power to flex onto other countries and emerge also as the domineering country, as it were. So this is not far from over. This is quite far from over, Fola.
David?
So I'm going to differ a bit
Okay.
from the first two opinions that have been expressed. I think the fashionable answer is to say that Africa should obviously pick its own side, where where the majority of the so-called non-aligned movement during the Cold War era, and that should continue to be the case because we face neither east nor west. We face forward. Those are very fashionable talking points. However, in terms of real politics, where it's clear that right now there are two options and only two options on the table, and that one of those options will have to be chosen regardless, because that's just the way the world works. The world's response to power, and not how things should be. It's just the way it is. I think right now the um the most sensible or the least destructive thing to do right now would be to at least temporarily create some sort of alignment with the Chinese way of doing things.
Okay.
For the simple reason that the the Chinese vision right now, there are two developmental visions that are available. One is very much Western driven, be that US or Europe, because they pretty much work in lockstep. And then there's the Chinese driven vision. Given that right now, at least for the time being, we know that is obviously going to change because all powerful nations eventually become empires, and all empires act the same eventually. But for now, given that China is not yet the imperial power that it probably will become someday, and for now we're still hearing things like non-interference and that sort of thing. And then, very importantly, for the fact that the type first of all, there's a willingness to invest in certain types of infrastructure and industry in Africa that you pretty much cannot get anywhere else. There's no one else that is putting down money to build rails linking industrial hubs and cities in Africa. Nobody else is doing that. There's nobody else putting down money to build industrial parks to create jobs for Africans. That's not the economic model that the other vision sees for Africa. The economic model that the other vision has for Africa is for it to be a mine, an oil well, and a farm for cash crops. And that's it. So if that means that it ends up being a place where the resources on the ground are worth more than the people who live on the ground, then so be it. Obviously, that vision doesn't align with our own interests as the Africans who live on the ground. So the vision, which sees it as a possibility or even a priority to invest in the development of an African middle class, that would seem to be, at least for the time being, the sort of less disastrous option to go with. Obviously, we do know that as time goes on and as Africa eventually starts to develop more economic heft and more diplomatic heft of its own, then we were going to have to start having those conversations about sort of becoming more non-aligned and building out what we think African worldview or the African vision should be. But right now, when we're in the situation where Africa's most populated country, statistically in Nigeria, more than 50% of the population is not connected to the internet till now. When we're dealing with these kinds of like extremely visceral problems where people don't have access to electricity, that sort of thing. 40 something percent of Nigerians don't have access to an all weather road, for example. And these are the issues that you're dealing with. Uh, the very famous words of uh, Deng, the Chinese Prime Minister in 1979, it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or the cat is white,
Right.
as long as it catches mice. So
Exactly.
right now, that's the sort of real politics I think we have to operate within.
All right. So we're
But
wrapping this conversation to a close. But Levy, you want to make a point
this was
quickly?
yeah. But the Chinese themselves are actually saying, well, you don't have to choose. This is what we're offering you, and we want to partner with you. You don't necessarily have to choose a side or pick a side. Just choose what's best for you. So I think the agency is still placed in Africa's hands, right? So you still have agency as a continent. Decide for yourselves what you want. And I think then the agreement has to be on what the common aspiration is. So, yes, we now have these things like the free continental trade area, but they're just so slow given the urgency of the action that needs to be taken. It just appears as if everything's just moving so slow. And the longer it takes, the further we get left behind. Paula.
Indeed. Which brings me to, I think, a final question I'm going to ask everyone today on this podcast is how much faith do you have in African leaders to leverage these partnership opportunity to uplift the individual nations, considering that we've talked about how that, as a continent, we should come together and have one uniform aspiration and have a common goal so that we can put together a united front. But we know that individually, our problems are different and there are different levels. So how much faith do you have in individual African leaders to handle this the way you think it should be handled? I'll start with you, Lonzen.
All right. Some of them will handle it very well.
Yeah.
They have the capacity to identify what are strategic things and what are tactical things and in between. Some of them will fumble it. They will totally go for the crumbs and they will be easily lured by the crumbs. And so when you talk about the grass suffering in this rivalry, the grass will suffer if African leaders are unable to identify common aspirations around which to leverage. And like I said, it's going to be very difficult for them to come together with common aspirations. The likely thing is that they will be divided further and they'll be divided by the crumbs that will be offered by those who wish to divide them and control them. And that is very unfortunate. But if it were possible for African leaders to identify common aspirations, unite around common aspirations, leverage them, then we would say, as the African elder in the names of Paul Kagame once said, if you want to be our enemy, you will not be disappointed. If you want to be our friend, you will not be disappointed.
So choose which one you want to be?
Yes, but that can only work if we have a united front.
What do you think? Levy, how much faith do you have?
I'm a very hopeful African, somewhat naive to some extent, but it has to start with the basic things. For example, right? Recently had China build the African Union pavilion where our leaders meet. We're very grateful. Those things should not be happening. right? The funding of the AU, for example, it's still very, very shallow. The contributions from African countries themselves, right? So the AU has to fundraise from, Europe, it has to fundraise from China itself. So there's a huge gap in terms of understanding what we need to do, the amount of dignity that we attach to our own agency as a people. So I'm hoping then that what Lonson was talking about earlier on, what sort of legacy do we bequeath to the next generation is a different talk together. But we have to start somewhere, and we have to start quite urgently. Like I said earlier, there's a Lagos Plan of Action, 1982. I wasn't even born in 1982, but here we are. I'm like, I'm 40, and I'm not very hopeful, for the rest of my life that we're going to change. But what about my daughter who's 4 years old? What's the kind of continent she's going to grow up in? So those are questions that are going to be, these are burning questions that we have to resolve one way or the other if Africa is going to have its place in the world. If not, then we will continue the 500 years of subjugation that David spoke about. They're going to turn into 700, 800, and 1,000 years. And that's not going to augur well for the people of Africa. Sorry to say.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Final words, David. What do you think?
Well, I don't know about faith in African leaders, but I definitely have faith in for two major reasons. First of all, unlike at any other time, most Africans statistically now have, or at least have access to infinite information and infinite communication via the internet and smartphones. So that in itself has upset the status quo. We're able to have conversations like this and distribute them on a large scale without necessarily having billions of dollars worth of investment to actually make that possible. So we have an advantage that no other generation has had before. So for that reason, I'm hopeful. Another reason I'm hopeful is that specifically in East Africa. I know that in the Horn of Africa, they have their issues in Ethiopia and Somalia, but East Africa specifically, or the East African community, in my opinion, represents like the green shoots of that sort of shared vision that group of countries has realized that, look, we don't need to like each other. We might actually quite dislike each other, but it doesn't stop us from working together because our destinies are inextricably linked. But just looking across the continent to East Africa and seeing what is happening in a political sense and an infrastructural sense, one can see that generally speaking, things are heading in the right direction. And being that it's going to be the driver of Africa going forward, that's just the reality. The population demographics say so. And the fact that it's such a young population means that this trend can only continue. So I definitely see hope.
All right. I like that. So we're ending this conversation on hope, right?
Yeah, I think he's saying that it's a generation where African aspirations can be nurtured.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been awesome having this conversation together. And wherever it is that you're watching this from or you're listening to this from, you can always join us again next week. Anywhere that you get your podcast from, we're going to be there on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube as well. So thank you very much. And of course, thank you to the team. Thank you to Pan African Review. That's the magazine that brings this podcast to you. It's called Africa Aspirations. My name is Fola. Thank you, Lonzen.
Thank you for hosting.
You're welcome. Thank you, David. Thank you, Levy.
Thanks so much.
Cheers, everyone.
See you again next week. Goodbye.